I'll
All
be
right,
video in one couple of minutes. I'm just eating some food because I haven't had dinner yet.
good. Bon appetite. I'm looking for my chart for the cord. I was in the American whiskey. Nobody was there.
We were there.
Yeah.
No, we
You
were there on Saturday.
Yeah, I came at 8. Wasn't it from 7 to 9?
Um, we were at the back. Did you ask for the meetup group?
Ah, so I think I saw at the very back how they were like very young people sitting in a long, like in a hidden room. But I don't know. I didn't think it was the group. I
Oh,
asked
yes.
and they said, and no, I didn't ask for a meter up group. I
Yeah, I'm
just
sorry we
asked,
missed you.
yeah, well, you know,
We weren't all young. Michael is almost 80, I think. 70? He's at 70 or 80.
I don't know. How old are you? You don't have to answer that. But they
I'm
were, I thought they were very young, and I thought, I don't know.
I'm middle aged, so um
Uh, I cannot find my cord for I'm gonna, until you eat, that's gonna be my task.
I'm wondering if there was a problem with the meetup link. We should really have more people in here by now. So let me do a little bit of triaging.
The link works for me, but and obviously for Ruth, but it is labeled with a 2019 date.
Yeah, I saw that. But it doesn't matter, it's the same link.
Might have scared some people off.
What was it labeled?
2019 date.
Yeah, 20.
December 20th, 2019.
It confused me for a minute, but then I decided that.
Well, you just got another visitor, another joiner. So maybe it's going to work.
Hi, Michael. Trying to figure out why we don't have more people here. I know that I accidentally posted it at a later time for the West Coast events. And that might be where the majority of people are from. And so we may be missing a bunch of people. Let me see. No, Toronto's East Coast. So
Garrett, you're probably aware there's a problem when you click on the link, it says host already has a meeting in progress.
well, I don't know why it's saying that. I did see that someone wrote that. Do you know why it's saying that? Because
No,
the same link for that I posted to all the meetups, I literally copy and pasted across all the meetups, and I'm the one that set it up. So
yeah. Well, I'll have a look because you're in the Freethinker meetup page and the Seattle Analytic meetup page. And it seems to be different across the two, the way it's set up. So I'll just go back and have a look at what's going on there. There's a notification saying that the meeting starts at 3:45 p.m.
yeah, now that was a time zone issue. I didn't I didn't remember that I had to switch the time zone because it
All right.
Ones that are not on US Eastern time zone, I forgot that I needed to switch the time zone.
Okay. So here's in the Free Thinker Institute meetup page. There's a link to register in advance. I'll put that in the chat just so you can see it, which one that is. So that's the one in the Free Thinker meetup page. I'll just put that there. Now I'm just wondering if the other one's different, which is in the Seattle Analytic. I'll copy that link. Yeah, that second one's the Seattle Analytic one. So they seem to be different. When I was going, anybody that's trying to get in through Seattle Analytics going to get that second link, I think, that's the one that says host has a meeting in progress.
Well, every meetup
yeah.
that has RSVPs, I posted this link to. So
All right.
now I just posted it a few minutes ago. So hopefully people will switch over to here.
Okay.
I did experiment with using the link to Zoom on Meetup, and that may have messed things up.
Yeah. I can put that new link in there too in the Seattle Analytic chat.
Yeah, please.
If you like. Yeah.
If I didn't already put it on in the group, then please post it.
Sure.
So this is normally our social portion, but we're dealing with logistical issues. So why don't we anybody want to introduce themselves and sort of what brings them to tonight's event? And maybe where you're coming from.
An interesting topic, really in a series now of clear thinking, I guess, that you seem to be doing, Garrett.
Yes, it's a critical thinking series.
Critical thinking, yeah. And should be taught in schools.
Really should.
I know some jurisdictions have said they don't want to teach critical thinking because it's a waste of children's time. They have more important things to learn. But I think that's a pretty nefarious thing to say, and it's obvious what the motivation is.
Yeah, it's harder to lead people who think critically.
Right.
But people who think critically make better decisions for themselves and those around them. So that's why we're teaching it. So. Anyone else introduce themselves and a little bit about what interests them in critical thinking in general, or fallacies specifically, if you wanted, if you're familiar with what they are?
Well, I'm Will. I'm in Australia, East Coast, North Brisbane. I'm interested in how I think most people, like lay people, are just so busy in life that they don't have time to analyze events, and they just take it at face value. And so as a result of that, the media, we're just cannon fodder for misinformation. because most people don't have critical thinking skills and do take things at face value. And I think this serves the government well, because we're just in a sort of a mire of confusion. And perhaps that's why they don't want to teach it in schools, because there is that theory, and it sounds a bit conspiracy theorist, but there is that theory that they want the masses to be confused, because we're much easier. Things that are confused are easier to control. So it's an interesting topic on different levels, I think.
If that's a conspiracy theory, I think it's the one that has the most legs that I've heard so far.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's really a conspiracy theory so much as, I mean, life is just so confusing. Like, so you go to take out an insurance policy, and there's, you know, so many different ones with so many different caveats, and it's the same with your electricity provider. There's so many different ones with so many different tariffs, and it's whatever you do, it's like it's been designed to frustrate and confuse. That's my theory. It's not meant to be this hard.
Yeah.
And people make silly, you know, as you say, Garrett, you know, if you're misinformed, I think you've said this before, if you're misinformed, you're more likely to make a rash decision.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like trying to read a legal document. It's virtually written in another language, which only lawyers understand.
Yep. Which is probably intentional. I mean,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
more specific language. So more specific language is important, but you know, you can write things in a way that's more specific, but does not, you know, but also is understandable by the layman. And I don't think that lawyers make any intent to do that, because then we wouldn't necessarily need them as much.
Absolutely.
And sorry for those that got the notice saying we were in another meeting. We'll try to straighten out the link so that it's that doesn't happen again. The person that used to post the links doesn't have time to do it anymore, and so I tried to do it myself last time, and I think I might have botched things up a little bit. But trying to play with the Zoom integration on Meetup. Anyone else want to introduce themselves and a little bit about what interests them in critical thinking?
I'll say hi. Oh, go on, Kat. Sorry.
The first ingredient is 1 cup all-purpose flour.
Oh,
Kat, were you trying to speak, or were you just not meaning to be off mute?
I think we got Kat's TV there. So I'll say hi.
Yeah,
hello. DLJ, still in the UK. Garrett, thanks for attending that session at Derek's while you were trying to get kids to school. I appreciate that. 2 hours, sorry. It took 2 hours in the end. The previous one was only an hour. I don't know how it took 2 hours. But so you missed the punchline, unfortunately, so I'll have to do it again.
Sorry about that. Yeah,
Okay.
I had an important meeting I had to run to at 9.
Right.
So
I appreciate you coming to any event. That was good. Thanks.
I don't attend too many others, to be honest, because I have so many of my own. But I did enjoy it. So thanks for teaching.
No worries.
Well, my name's Michael Strasberg. I live in New Jersey. I've been a member of the FTI for a while. I participate in these meetings, and I also participate in our Sunday membership meetings, which I find quite rewarding. And I'm interested in everything that goes on in these Tuesday meetings, but critical thinking is especially important to me, because one of the things that I'm very susceptible to is fallacious arguments, where something seems to make sense, but if you dive more deeply, it doesn't make sense. So I'm interested in learning how to flesh out fallacies to be able to repudiate false arguments.
Great. Anyone else want to introduce themselves and what?
I'm wondering how we apply.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Can I just add to what was just said there from Michael? Yeah, so there's one thing is to point out where fallacies are in what people are saying, but then there's the other thing is to is to deal with their reaction when they retreat into their "I'm right" kind of thing. So you said, well, this is the fallacy. I'm not accepting it because they don't understand the fallacy. So how do you deal with that? Is probably the question I want to ask.
Yeah. Plus a lot. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Should I introduce myself?
Yeah.
Or were you two dialoguing? Okay. No, my name is Joe, and I really appreciate critical thinking because it means you have an open mind more than anything else. That you're willing to take in new information and actually challenge your own personal beliefs. So, and I think that that's a virtue. It's like a virtue of courage. So,
Agree.
and it combines courage and wisdom.
You're practicing Stoic, Joe?
I try.
Then that's all we can all do.
Yeah.
We'll have a meetup on Stoicism. Yeah, I have a take on the four virtues, sort of with a little bit of my 2 cents added in, sort of how I interpret the four virtues in combination with each other. And I've created a graphic that I'm working on trying to improve the quality of. But I think the wisdom is there, but we'll keep we'll we have a couple months yet till we get there, so hopefully I'll have figured it out by then. So with that said, thanks. Intro. So I'm gonna sort of kick things off here. My name's Garrett Lang. I am a software developer turned software inventor and now an entrepreneur. My hobby is writing and discussing practical philosophy, and I'm also the executive director of the Freethinker Institute. And tonight's event is brought to you by the Freethinker Institute. We advertise to a bunch of different meetups. I'll send a little more information about the FTI into the chat. And let me pull that up. So I will put those in now. And basically, we're a not-for-profit looking to support and empower members. We really want to help people be the best versions of themselves, to seek truth and to be fair through transformational personal and professional development. And that's the first of what we call the 5 intentions, which are the common values that hold the community together. We have free events like this one on Tuesday evenings covering a wide range of topics not typically covered in academia or industry, at least not widely. And then we have weekly members only events that Michael alluded to. He's a member and will be moderating with me tonight, kind of my co-host. Those are about applying practical wisdom into our daily lives. We have only one rule in the FTI, and that is to remain polite. All ideas are welcome, but they should be communicated politely. I recommend trying to, stay polite so that we can all kind of keep ourselves in the logical portion of the brain, which thinks rationally rather than getting emotional or in the fight or flight area in the worst case scenario. Instead of trying to prove other people wrong, try to do what we call in the FTI listening to understand, which is trying to understand where other people are coming from. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And
would you like to make my announcement now?
Yes, please do.
Okay. What we ask is that everybody listen to the presentation and not interrupt with questions or statements. If you have an idea, a statement, a question, jot it down, and when Garrett has finished, we'll have a discussion forum, and at that point, you can bring those things up.
Yeah, we'll have plenty of time for conversation. I think I'll probably go, my guess is about half an hour, although I haven't timed it. So that said, thank you, Michael. And so what I'm going to start with is kind of an orientation of what we're teaching in terms of critical thinking. I call this my tower of critical thinking. So it started with a discussion about research or information literacy, which is pulling information from a variety of sources. And then we narrow that information down to what's credible using evidence evaluation. And so some of this information gets lost right here. And then we talked a little bit about types of inference, some of which can have, come to the wrong conclusions, and we have to know how good different types of inference are. The ones that come to wrong conclusions are the ones that fall off the cliff of the tower of logic, and some of our biases can lead us off a cliff as well if we aren't aware of them. But by being aware of them, we remain on the climbing the tower of critical thinking. Formal logic is a pretty solid way of coming to conclusions if we use it carefully. But when you don't use formal logic carefully, you fall into fallacies. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is the fallacies that may seem like logical thinking, but it actually isn't logical thinking. It often convinces people when it shouldn't. And so being aware of what those fallacies are, or at least the most common ones, there are a very large number of fallacies. You won't be able to memorize all of them, but just being aware of what they are, at least the most commonly occurring ones, will, I think, help you make better decisions and come to a better conclusion as to what's true and what's not true. And all of that is, and actually I need to make a slight tweak. All of that is in the service of creating knowledge. And that knowledge is about what's fact and fiction. And then the knowledge of what's fact and fiction is used in the service of wisdom, which I would argue is preventing significant unnecessary harm and increasing happiness and decreasing harm once we've prevented significant unnecessary harm for everyone. And those will be the last two lecture discussions in the series. So that said, this is kind of an orientation as far as an agenda. These are the fallacies we're going to be talking about. We'll talk about what are logical fallacies. I also have a slide on why they're important. And then these are the types of fallacies we're going to get into. Since we're going to cover them one at a time, I won't go into them all in the agenda, but you can kind of look at them and see if these are the ones you're familiar with. And let me just put my screen up. Okay. So logical fallacies are basically reasoning that may seem sound to us psychologically, but actually turns out to be based on flawed or inaccurate logic. So it's not super complicated. It's just an argument that sounds like it just makes intuitive sense, and people might say, oh, well, that's common sense that this is true. But actually, it turns out that even though that argument sounds seductively sweet, it turns out to be fatally flawed. And so that's really what a fallacy is. Sorry, just taking a quick note. So why is it important to understand fallacies? Fallacies will help us come to false conclusions. So we'll think something's true that's actually false, or vice versa. We'll think something's false that's actually true. And false conclusions result in poor decisions because we're basically, basing our tower of critical thinking, and, we're basing our knowledge on false knowledge. And so the wisdom in our decisions will be flawed because, we have a misunderstanding about reality itself or people's opinions. By having a misunderstanding about reality itself or people's opinions, we're going to come to poor conclusions and make bad decisions. And so it's really important to be aware of these, to be conscious of them, and to be vigilant so that when someone tries to use a fallacy to convince you, that you're not convinced by it, but that you can actually politely point out that they are actually, using a fallacy for their reasoning. And a lot of people do this without even being aware of it, to be honest. They don't even know what fallacies are, let alone that they're, using one or committing one. And so, don't be surprised if if you say that's an ad hominem fallacy, then they may not know what you're talking about, and you can hopefully show them. And so let's speak about ad hominem fallacy. This is a super common one. These are actually presented in the order that you'll find them, from the most common to the least common, I think. And so this is when you attack the person making an argument rather than the argument itself. So if you say, say two people are arguing, and I have a more polite example here, which is you can't trust John's opinion on politics. He didn't even finish high school. That's technically an ad hominem fallacy, but usually this will come across more like you can't just trust John's opinion on politics. He's an idiot, right? Or he's stupid, or something like that. And they'll try to discredit the person giving the opinion rather than try to discredit the opinion itself. And so that's basically an ad hominem fallacy. The way to prevent that is to focus on the argument and the evidence, not the person making it. And you want to evaluate the claim based on whether or not that claim has merit, whether the person can back it up or not, and not who it is that's making it. I've had people who didn't graduate high school make really good arguments, like about some of the essays that I've written, that were, at a level that most people who were college graduates or even PhDs could not make an argument about. And so, keeping in mind that, education level, and that's why that's actually, I'm sort of getting deeper into another fallacy, rather than ad hominem, more of an argument of authority, which we'll get into in a bit. But this is ad hominem. So next is a straw man fallacy. That's where I'm just going to mute you because there's some background noise coming out. So the straw man fallacy is when you misrepresent someone's argument to make it easier to attack. So you basically attack an argument that is not the argument of the person you're talking with. So an example of this is my opponent believes in healthcare reform. He must want to leave hardworking taxpayers footing the bill for freeloaders, right? Now, no one really wants to leave hardworking taxpayers footing the bill for freeloaders. So that's why it's a straw man fallacy, because clearly no one actually has that opinion. But by making a claim against the healthcare reform, saying that it's causing something that clearly nobody would like, even the person proposing it wouldn't like that. Basically you're straw manning it. Let me think if I can come up with a better example, because I don't love that one. Like a typical straw man fallacy that I hear with free will is, people will say, in order for human beings to have free will, we would have to be able to fly if we have free will. And clearly human beings can't fly, so human beings don't have free will. Well, no one that advocates for free will, advocates that human beings should be able to fly if we have free will. And so that's a straw man that is misrepresenting the perspective of people who argue that we have free will, like myself, and tries to, basically make it easier to attack, because clearly none of us can fly. So, but that's not really the argument that people who argue for free will make, is that people can fly. That's an argument that human beings are omnipotent, which no one would really argue. So that's another example of a straw man fallacy. So the trick is to really do what I was calling, what I was referring to as listening to understand, which is really understand an argument fully before you critique it. Even goes so far as to repeat that argument back to someone to make sure that you understand it. Because if you can repeat back to someone the argument so well that they feel like you explained it even better than they could, then you've shown that you really understand the actual argument itself rather than a straw man of it. People often straw man, like I said, without realizing it. They don't even realize they're straw manning an argument. They just think that the person's perspective is so crazy that they're going to critique how crazy they think it is. But the thing that's crazy is not really the perspective of the person that they're critiquing. And so they end up strawmanning them unintentionally very often. So again, like, fallacies can be used maliciously, but I would argue they're more often used innocently by people who don't even realize they're doing them. So, always ask for clarification and try not to oversimplify complex issues. Appeal to authority. This is when someone tries to argue that a claim has to be true because an expert or authority believes it. So saying celebrity X uses the skin care product, so it must be the best. They have great skin, and therefore they said use the skincare product. They're an authority, therefore we must believe them. Another example would be, so-and-so is a PhD in philosophy, and they told me that free will wasn't true, and therefore they must be right that free will isn't true because they're a PhD in philosophy. Just because someone has a PhD in a subject doesn't mean they're all-knowing about that subject. None of us are all-knowing, and there's a diverse set of opinions by even the authorities on a subject. And quite frankly, sometimes the authorities aren't right. And, like at one point in time, all the authorities said Earth was flat and that the sun revolved around the Earth. So, authorities have been wrong many, many times throughout history, even the majority of authorities. So it's much better to remember that, just because someone's an expert doesn't mean that they're definitely right. It is worthwhile to recognize that expertise does have value. It's not to say that we should devalue expertise, simply that we shouldn't blindly follow expertise and not question it. But if an expert has a really good opinion, I like, Einstein's, saying, which is that if you understand something well enough, you can explain it to a 6-year-old. A lot of authorities like to use hand-waving arguments and say, they try to like spin your head with complex words or ideas that they're not explaining to you so that you'll be confused enough that you'll just listen to them. And that's not really something that a self-confident person will do. If someone is self-confident and really knows their subject matter, they'll explain it to you in a way that you'll understand, knowing your background. They won't try to confuse you, but there are a large number of people that will try to confuse you because they don't have a really solid reason for believing what they believe. And there are also people who really do know what they're talking about, but just can't explain things in simple terms. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but I would argue that's more the exception rather than the norm. Next is the false dilemma fallacy. And so this is a false dichotomy. So this occurs when someone presents two options or sides when there are actually more. And so, people say you're either with us or you're against us, right? It's one or the other. You're either my friend or my enemy. Well, can't I be neutral? Like Switzerland's been neutral for quite a while, right? Can't we be neutral? Isn't that a possible third choice? And, I hear the argument a lot that, you're either male or female. And then my answer is, well, what about a hermaphrodite that has the sexual organs of both sexes? And, theoretically, there's a third option. So male or female only is actually a false dichotomy. So, you want to recognize that not everything is black and white. There are certain things that are, I think fairly safe to say that, are black and white. It's a minority. Most of the time there's a lot of nuance and there's middle ground. And, I like to say extremes are extremely, what was I'm blanking on it. Extremes are generally extremely bad ideas. And so, thinking that there's only black or white or, one extreme or the other sort of misses the often most valuable insight, which is the middle ground where people are trying to bridge the gap between the two extremes. And that is, if you read the links that I posted about the FTI, one of the reasons that the FTI exists is to bridge the gap between the two polar extremes of politics in the US. Because right now we do have a lot of political divisiveness, and we really want to create a community where people can express all opinions, including in those extremes. And you know, and so but that we all can kind of come to our own conclusions about what the right answers are. And so sort of encouraging people to think for themselves, but not think for themselves and be fooled easily, but think for themselves with great critical thinking skills, so they won't be fooled, so we won't be fooled easily, and we'll come to better conclusions. Next is the slippery slope fallacy. I see this one happen all the time. This is when someone takes the relatively logical first step, and then sort of exaggerates it to beyond the point of reasonable comparison. And so someone says, if we allow, like an example is, if we allow students to redo this test, they'll want to redo every assignment, and then they'll just stop studying altogether. Right? Well, that's probably not going to happen, right? If you let students redo one test, they would probably be appreciative. And it's not like the whole student, the whole class is going to go up into rebellion. Just like, what's an example? I mean, I think that's a fair example. So, and so you really want to question whether or not, whether or not someone's assertion is really justifiable given given what's being stated, and you want to look for not just whether or not the initial claim is valid, but whether or not all of the chain of claims are valid, because people will sort of take things out of context and sort of exaggerate them to the extreme to make it sound ridiculous. And this is super common, where people just exaggerate so much that no one would agree with it at that point, but they make it seem like it's in line with a small step that people are actually asking for, but that sort of vilifies maybe a good idea, what may be a good idea. Circular argument, begging the question. And I hope religious people will forgive me for this example, but it's when the conclusion of the argument is based on the premise of that same argument. I'll use a non-religious example as well, which may be even more controversial, but so people will say the Bible is the word of God, and then I'll say, well, how do you know? And then they'll say, because God tells us that the Bible is the word of God. And it's like, well, you're just assuming that the Bible is the word of God, and I actually think there's a ton of wisdom in the Bible, and I think it's God inspired. But to say that we know definitively that every word in the Bible is straight from God with no intermediaries, I mean, people wrote down the Bible, and they wrote it down hundreds of years after Jesus's death, for the most part, at a minimum. So even if you say that Jesus was the Son of God, the Bible itself had many points at which it could have been, misconstrued or misconstructed. And so you want to look for independent evidence that supports conclusions, and be aware that people will often assume the conclusion in the assumption or in the assertions or the initial statements, and then act like they're proving something in a logical argument, when actually they assumed that thing to be true in the very beginning. And if you assume something to be true in the very beginning of an argument, well, of course you're going to prove it to be true, because you assumed it was true, and that's not a valid argument. And so the other example, which may be just as controversial in this group as the Bible is the word of God, is I won't name the famous determinist that made this argument, but I will name him. It was Sam Harris, and I read his essay on why he's a determinist, and he pretty much assumed that if you have cause and effect, that cause and effect are deterministic. And if you assume that cause and effect are always deterministic, you have a circular argument. You're basically assuming cause and effect are deterministic, And then you're saying if you believe in cause and effect, then it must be deterministic. And so that's an example of a circular argument as well. And I don't mean to digress on free will, but it makes for good examples because it's something that I've studied, a lot. So hasty generalization fallacy is the next one. So this is when someone makes a sweeping statement without considering all the facts. So I met a rude person from country X, name whatever country you want, and then people from that country are all rude, right? Just like a broad sweeping statement from one data point. We learned about I think it was abductive reasoning, which is kind of like, this is an extreme example of that, where you're taking a very small sample size and then making broad sweeping statements in like trying to show that your single data point is true, and therefore some broad sweeping statement is true. You really don't want to draw broad conclusions from a small number of observations unless you're really forced into a corner and you have to, which is when abductive reasoning, like in detective work and stuff like that, where you don't have a choice, you don't have more observations, you only have, what was at the scene of the crime to go on. You really want to look for larger and more representative samples before generalizing. And even then, you want to be careful about whether or not your generalizations are on solid territory. I met someone in a conversation group that said, like Black people commit more crimes than white people. And so I researched this, and it turned out that, and so he said we as white people should be afraid of Black people because Black people commit more crimes than white people. And so when I researched it, and I researched it fairly deeply, I learned not only that actually he was accurate that Black people do commit more crimes in the US than white people, but most of that crime is actually Black on Black crime. And so actually white people aren't more in danger from, like him, we're not more in danger from Black people than they would be from anyone else. And I don't think I didn't get to the point of controlling for socioeconomic disparity, which I think would be the right logical approach to take, because generalizations based on race are generally bad ideas. And so we're going to have another conversation about racism and stereotypes. That could fall under both or either. But much better to look for large statistically significant sample sizes that are representative and have a logical basis for them. People don't choose skin color when we're born, and to think that something that none of us chose when we were born is going to statistically significantly increase something that we do choose, which is causing crimes, probably there's a better explanation for the thing that he was so upset about. And so even though he may have a valid point of the statistics, his logical reasoning wasn't very good. So red herring fallacy. This is when someone introduces irrelevant information in order to distract people from the topic at hand. And this happens all the time. I mean, this is super common. So, I know I forgot to take out the trash, but did I mention that I did well on my last math test, right? Like that has nothing to do with, this is like a, if your child says, I know I forgot to take out the trash, but I did well on my last math test. Like that's not the point. If you forgot to take out the trash, you should say, sorry, I forgot to take out the trash, right? And, this is one of those things that happens very frequently in debates on politics. I'll see person A say, well, your political party did X bad thing. And then person B, who they said it to, will say, yeah, but what about this bad thing that's, this person from your political party did, right? And they'll just, totally ignore the actual point that the person was making. And then, it's called whataboutism to do this, is like to say, well, what about, right? Instead of actually addressing the topic that's brought up, you say, well, what about this other situation that is the one that I care about and I'm going to talk about, and I'm not going to actually acknowledge what you said, and even if it was a valid and important thing. and ignoring valid and important things, and bringing up something that's totally irrelevant, or not necessarily even totally irrelevant, but maybe even that, makes that person's point, but ignoring the things that go against that person's point, and or that support that person's point, and then bringing up things that go against it, is basically giving into our confirmation bias. And we had another event on confirmation bias and how important it is to be vigilant that we don't only feed our confirmation bias or believe facts that support our confirmation bias. And this is a little bit related to that, in my opinion. So you want to stay focused on the topic at hand to prevent this from happening, and don't let either irrelevant or red herring fallacy is about irrelevant, but I would also argue don't ignore the initial point in the first place is the most important part, in my opinion, and to acknowledge the points that are made and be willing to acknowledge the things that disagree with your current opinion. That's what being aware of confirmation bias is about. And I like to say it's okay to be wrong, because if you admit you're wrong with good judgment, you're immediately more right than you were before. So it's okay to acknowledge if someone has a good point that helps you learn from them. Next is the post hoc ergo propter. Okay, hoc. After this, therefore, because of this. So this is when someone assumes that because one event happened after another, the first event caused the second. And so if I say I wore my red sweater today and aced my test, my red sweater is lucky and therefore makes me smart. Well, no, that's not a logical, sound conclusion, right? That just is a coincidence that I'm kind of drawing conclusions that don't make sense from. And you want to remember that correlation does not imply causation. That's a common phrase that you'll hear people say, correlation, not causation. Yeah, the red sweater and the good test score were correlated, but they were not causation. It wasn't your red sweater that caused that great test score. And so just because something follows another does not mean that they're causal. And that's where we talked about inference types and we talked about causal inference. A lot of science and math goes into creating causal inference and creating a causal relationship. And when that happens, then you can believe that it's causal, but you can't just, point out a correlation and act like it's causation. That's a fallacy. So next is an appeal to ignorance. This is when someone argues that a claim has to be true because it hasn't been proven false. So no one has been able to disprove the existence of aliens, therefore they must exist. We had another event on aliens where I made I think a pretty good argument that aliens probably do exist. And we even had someone that came that said they saw an alien ship, and it was someone that, has credibility. So, but the example of saying that just because no one has been able to disprove it, therefore they exist, is not true, because you could also say no one has been able to disprove the existence of unicorns, so they must exist. If you change aliens for unicorns, well, you can't disprove the existence of something. That's actually a logical impossibility. You can disprove the existence of something within a certain space, but you can't disprove it in the edges of the universe. It's a logical fallacy to say just because people haven't proven it doesn't exist, therefore it must. The burden of proof is with the person making the claim. And so if you want to claim something is true, you have to back that claim up. And so the claim is not just true because someone else hasn't proven it false. You have to, if you want to assert that something is true, you have to have a good logical reason for believing it if you want to convince critical thinkers that it's true. If you want to convince people that fall for fallacies, then it's much easier. But that's why we're here, is to not be those people that fall for fallacies. So now I'm going to talk about how to apply what we just talked about. Okay, mi amor. Sorry, my daughter's just got home. So if you want to, if you basically see someone that just committed a fallacy, you want to look up the fallacy. I recommend using ChatGPT. Ahí está reunión, estás lindísima, mi amor. Está lindísima, pero papi está en reunión, princesa. Lo siento. No puedo ahora. Papi está en reunión, mi amor. Te amo, princesa. Sorry. You want to look up the fallacy, or if you remember it from tonight, that's great. And then you want to see whether or not the assessment is accurate or whether or not it's a fallacy. And then you want to or whether or not their assertion is accurate. And then if it's inaccurate, then you want to explain why. If it's accurate, you want to acknowledge it and reassess your opinion given the situation. And this is where I have my little quote about being okay to admit that, having it be okay to admit that you're wrong. But if you point out someone is committing a fallacy in a polite way, and we'll talk about what in a polite way means here. We have a giving feedback the FTI way, which is you always want to be polite. You want to make sure the other person isn't emotional. If they are, wait till they're calmer. And then you want to ask questions to make sure you understand their perspective well enough that you're not committing a fallacy of your own of another type. And so you want to make sure you understand that they're making the assertion that really means that they're committing a fallacy. If it turns out they are committing a fallacy and you understand their perspective well, give them a good reputation to live up to and say what you appreciate about them, that's true. And then you want to say that you have something to share that they may find useful and that you think that you saw a logical fallacy in what they said, and explain what one is. If they don't know, you can ask them if they know what a logical fallacy is, and then explain what the fallacy is, as well as their perspective using an example of the fallacy. And it's best to use a really clear example of why it's a fallacy and why it's a bad leap of judgment. And then you want to remember to maintain the 5 positive moments to one, or comments to one negative comment in the relationship. This is going to count as a negative one because you're giving them feedback. And so make sure that, you had 4 or 5 things to say, for every one negative that you have, because that's one of the secrets to maintaining healthy relationships. And you also don't want to be attached to them agreeing with you. You can point out that someone used a fallacy. Some people are just going to get angry at that. Not, say, no, that wasn't a fallacy. Listen with an open mind, but if you're really sure that you're right, then, you can ask for another person's opinion. But, sometimes it's best to just let people stew on something and think about it themselves. And, people aren't always convinced right when they're given feedback, but sometimes when they get some time to think on their own in a quiet place, they can be more open to it then. And some people just can't be convinced no matter what you say to them. And, and we all have to decide who we want to spend our time with. I try to stick with people who want to be the best versions of themselves, seek truth, and be fair, which is the first of the 5 intentions. And with people who really agree with the 5 intentions, because for me, that's like a common ground of reasonable thinking and reasonable ideas. The 3rd intention, by the way, is to hone your critical thinking skills, which is what this series is all about. So, and then another thing that someone mentioned was what's it called? Having an open mind. I think it was Joe who said critical thinking includes having an open mind. The 2nd intention is to transparently share your beliefs to the extent that you trust someone, and also to have an open mind that that person, to what other people say that will help you learn from them on how to be the best version of yourself, seek truth, and be fair. And so I do agree, having an open mind is critical. And I do think it's a part of critical thinking skills, although I have it a little bit separately in the 5 intentions, because I put it even higher than, just honing your critical thinking skills, because if your mind isn't even open, you won't even be open to learning critical thinking skills, right? So having an open mind is key to growth and learning. People whose mind isn't open don't learn anymore, for the rest of their lives, because their mind isn't open to new truths. So that said, I welcome feedback on whether this was helpful. Feel free to write in the chat. If you found this helpful, I would love the feedback. Michael has a quick announcement for the Q&A portion.
Okay, we're going to ask that everybody limit their comments to either one comment or one question, and try to keep your discussion about 3 minutes, because we want everybody to have an opportunity to participate.
Yeah, Joe, go ahead.
It was a helpful presentation. I very much appreciate it. So I think one of the more interesting ones is the appeal to authority.
Yeah.
Specifically, a lot of times there are requirements, and requirements, that aren't challenged, primarily because they've been, they've come, people that have come up with them are usually pretty esteemed. And sometimes it's effective to simplify things and actually, cut through some of the ambiguity that exists in requirements in order to actually not only meet them, but to actually do better. And they do this at they do this at Tesla, to be quite honest, where they hired people away from other firms, or actually automakers primarily, because they have they were just their job just was about meeting requirements, not necessarily coming up with something better than the requirements even had to offer. So that's just one example, but I would think a good question out of that is, what's the criteria for, following authority and versus actually, going up against it or challenging it.
Yeah, so I would say we had in the early, I'm trying to remember which one it was on. Like I have I'm going to share an essay that I wrote on trust, and what it does is it sort of gives you a series of things in priority order that will make a source more or less trustworthy. And so this is where I would apply these kind of rules of like what makes someone more or less trustworthy, and authorities that have shown themselves to be really trustworthy. Number 3 in that is people who make logical arguments, and I'm going to use a controversial case here, Joe, where I would argue you're right that a lot of times authorities are not challenged because the people who come up with them are pretty esteemed. If you look at cosmologists, right, pretty smart group of guys, and they said that time began at the Big Bang. And we had another conversation on my perspective on the origins of the universe, where I argued something else, which is that time did not start at the Big Bang. But if you look at the argument at face value of time started at the Big Bang, how did that first moment in time come about if time itself didn't exist? Like, how could it have even like logically come about? And so I would argue that's a case where authorities are making an argument that doesn't really have a logical basis to say that the first moment in time came about. They can't really even explain it very well. And if you ask them what existed, 100 or a billion years before the first moment in time, they will give words, but those aren't words that they can make logical arguments from. And I would argue it's that kind of case where they're trying to confuse people to the point where they will believe them because they're authorities rather than because they have a good logical argument. And again, I'll go with Einstein, which if you can explain it, if you understand something well enough, you can explain it to a 6-year-old. And I happen to have 2 6-year-olds, so I get a lot of testing on this because I explain a lot of stuff to my 6-year-olds. And so Yeah. Does that make sense, Joe?
Absolutely. I appreciate the answer.
Yeah, no problem. Feel free to check out that essay that I put in the chat. I think you might like it. And that said, I want to let Rose go. I'm glad you raised your hand, Rose. You had a bunch of good comments, but I wasn't able to read them all, but I glanced. So I would love to hear what you have to say.
Hi there. Yeah, so I really love this topic, and actually I have a book. It's called The Art of Thinking Clearly by Ralph Dobely. I don't know if you've come across this book, but he outlines 99 different thinking fallacies. So if you're interested in this topic, I recommend you guys get this book. But one of the two actually fallacies that I was hoping you would talk about, which you did not, is the sunk cost fallacy,
Yes.
which I've dealt with recently, and also the confirmation bias. So those are really really good ones.
They are.
Do you want me to explain a little bit?
Yeah, I would love for you to
what they
explain the
are?
sunk cost fallacy to people. I'm very familiar with that one. We had a whole nother event on confirmation bias, and that's actually a type of bias. So I think we will probably cover it on bias, but the sunk cost fallacy would be a good one to cover.
Well, yeah, bias is also like a thinking fallacy as well, that kind of go together. But yeah, the sunk cost fallacy is basically like when you invest in something, for example, like you invest your time into something or your money into something, or you're invested emotionally into something, it's harder for you to walk away from it, because you say to yourself, well, I've made it this far, let me just keep going, right? And that is a fallacy, because it's even you dismiss the fact that you're unhappy, you dismiss a lot of other signs that you should walk away. You keep losing money, for example. Things are not going well, and yet you continue to keep going with it just because you invested in it. So that is a fallacy that a lot of people, for example, like let's say they went to college for something and they're not really passionate about it, or they're not happy about it, or it wasn't what they expected, but they get a job in that field anyway just because they've spent four years degree and like a lot of money on it. Same thing with like a marriage. Let's say like you get married and you're not really in love with that person anymore, but you continue just because you've already invested time and you had a wedding and people came, and then you don't want to embarrass yourself and other people. So yeah, people continue to do things that they're unhappy with just because of the sunk cost fallacy. So watch out for that.
Yeah, I think those are great examples of sunk cost fallacies. The trick to, I like to in the presentation say, how do you avoid these things? The way to avoid a sunk cost fallacy is to only look from this current point going forward. And starting today, if you were to do what, you want to look at, just completely discount everything in the past other than lessons learned. And you do want to count lessons learned in the past, but you don't want to count how much money or time you put into things, because just because you put a lot of time or money into something doesn't mean that it's going to be the best path forward for you. So, I think your point about like a college degree is a good one, and a marriage is a good one, where just because you've invested a lot into those, that doesn't mean that they're going to be the ones that are the right path forward for you. So,
and then the other way to challenge that is maybe to ask yourself, like, if I continue on this trajectory 5 years from now, 10 years from now, am I going to be happy, or am I going to regret it? Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Great point, Rose. Thank you. Katie, you want to go next?
That was an interesting comment about investment in something. My comment was going to be, I guess, a personal anecdote. One of the biggest mistakes I've made in critical thinking is trusting that people in authoritative positions knew what they were doing, rather than doing my own research on it. I would just like, oh, they must know what they're doing. and I'll just follow them. And that can be a big mistake.
I agree completely. And, you know, it's all too common that people don't really know what they're doing. And, you know, the number of people, you know, that go by fake it till you make it. There are a lot of people in very high positions that are faking it till they make it. And even if they've made it, they're still faking it. And so, you know, I think it's better to, you know, I teach a product management boot camp, and what I teach is that our boot camp actually has a different philosophy, which is learn it till you earn it. And I think if you come at it from a perspective of learn it till you earn it instead of fake it till you make it, you'll be on solid ground and you'll be able to even logically challenge, but you want to do it in a polite way. And a good book on you know, this is the 48 Laws of Power, although I don't love that book because half of what it teaches is super unethical and I don't recommend following, but it's still worth reading to know how people are who have read that book are sometimes acting. But for the corporate world, it's a good book to know, because you it's okay to challenge authority to a certain degree, but if you challenge authority too much and too successfully, you know, that authority may well be, you know, look for retribution, if you will. And so, you know, asking thoughtful questions and then giving the authority the credit for, you know, finding the right answer when you were the one that led them there. And you know, things like that. You know, and we're getting into corporate politics now, but I think you're right, Katie, that you don't want to just assume that authorities know what they're talking about. That's 100% for sure. Kathy, go ahead.
Oops. There. This spring, I took an online seminar with sponsored by it's a yearly thing that National Institutes of Health does, NIH, about vitamins and nutritional supplements. And it was mostly focused on how people could determine whether a study is accurate, or how to interpret data to get the real picture about efficacy and safety and things like that. And then during the seminar, it went on for 3 days, so there's a lot of information. One thing they happened to mention, just as an example, that studies would show that most people that were hospitalized with COVID showed low levels of vitamin D. And then we might think that, oh, okay, well, vitamin D can help COVID or prevent COVID, but it's not correct thinking, because you have to consider things like possibly most people that would take vitamin D supplements might also take better care of themselves in general other ways. So you can't, it's just not it's illogical to draw a conclusion unless you have all of the information and factors. I think that's related to the subject. But I just thought it was interesting that people they were not saying whether things were good for you or bad for you, because it was just so complicated. They were mostly interested in what the public was interested in, and how to keep the public safe, and how to interpret studies, which is it's really complicated.
Great, thanks for sharing, Kathy. Rose, you said another thing in chat, if you don't mind my bringing it out, because we don't have any hands, I'm going to, which is that white men commit more white-collar crimes. I would argue that not only is that true, but they're often unprosecuted. If you look at, and it's not just white men that committed these crimes, but if you look at the number of realtors that falsified W-2 records in the 2008 financial crisis to help their clients buy homes that they couldn't afford, you know, those were white-collar crimes and no one was prosecuted for them. But they were literally falsifying documents to get their clients loans for homes they couldn't afford. And they knew they were going to default on those loans. And that would, you know, that large number of defaulting is what led to the mortgage-backed security defaulting. And yet none of those crimes were prosecuted. Now, probably there would have been a very large number of people that got in trouble, but to me, that would have been the right answer. Like, you know, if we're busting people for years in prison for smoking a joint, you know, which is now going away, which is good, but you know, people are very hard on drugs, but then white collar crime seems to be largely ignored. And there are many more examples than the one that I gave, but that's a very extreme example. Kathy, you put your hand back up again. Did you have another comment?
Yeah, 'cause
I was gonna just have a
Oh,
quick
sorry. Let me
response.
let Rose respond to that. So
Yeah, no, I just want to say, like, you know, the current prison system or criminal justice system in the United States, you're more likely to be in jail if you're poor and innocent than if you're rich and guilty. So it's like the criminal system is skewed to favor the rich, you know, over the poor, right? And it's like when we look at crime, it's like we have to look at all of crime, not just a particular, like when you were talking about black on black crime, that's like a violent crime, I would say. But like
yeah,
we don't look at like financial crimes, for example, and like we seldom think of those as like crimes, but those have really significant consequences and affect more people.
yeah,
Like if a crime is committed, for example, by a corporation, that's gonna have like larger ramifications across the board than if somebody did like a petty crime, you know, in the street, right? So, but like, you know, who's likely to get punished? It's the petty crime person is likely to get punished more so than the white collar crime. So it's like the system is not fair. And also when we look at who's being criminalized, like, you know, blacks are more likely to get harsher sentences and longer sentences than white criminals. So we have to look at it in a very nuanced way. And that's why I like the critical thinking, like critical thinking is very important.
sorry.
That's why like we need to, like, when we think critically, we have to really think critically, which means that looking at something in a more nuanced way, which takes a lot of dig dipping. Like you have to dig deeper and like you try to find the right data and try to find quantifiable and qualifiable like evidence, and it takes time. So people want like a quick, like the generalization or answer to something, but it's like if you want the truth, it takes a long time to get to the truth.
Yeah. No, the truth requires research and understanding. Although if you have someone that can, you know, explain it in a succinct and logical and well-researched way, you can learn the truth very efficiently. And that's part of what we're trying to do with the FTI is create a community of people who can do that for each other. And that's what I try to do on these events on Tuesday evenings when I'm presenting, and, you know, other presenters do the same thing. One thing that you said is that the system's not fair. I would argue that corporations are autocratic by nature, which is where I was sort of cautioning Katie, like, yes, you can challenge the people in authority, but if they're your boss and they get mad that you're challenging them, they can fire you, whether they have a good reason to or not. Right. And in an autocracy, it just matters whether someone's above you, not whether or not they're right. And so, you know, while we do live in a democracy in terms of, you know, still technically we sort of live in a democracy, even though bribery has been legalized in our democracy. So we're at the beginning of the end of democracy if we don't turn things around. But we do still technically live in a democracy in terms of the way that laws are written. But in terms of, you know, the way that a third of our time is spent in corporate America, it's an autocracy. You know, that's how corporations are run. So that said, you know, thank you again for your comment. Oh, and Rose, I wanted to ask if you have statistics on the, I don't know if you were saying it just sort of anecdotally, but if you actually have statistics on the fact that you're more likely to be in jail if you're poor and innocent than if you're rich and guilty, I would love places that I could further research that.
I can recommend a book.
Yeah.
I'll write it for you.
Yeah, write it in the chat and then we'll let Sean go.
Hello, everyone. Gary and Rose, I think you both already committed a fallacy. I don't know what type of fallacy. Most likely it's a red herring. Okay. You both said, okay, white collar crime commit more crime than others. his crime have a severity. Okay. I think every person, every human being, first thing you worry about your safety, your life. That's number one thing. That's more important than that, right? Say corporation or white collar, like a Bernie Murdoch. Okay, those crime hurt people is financially, right? Yes, or somebody committed, say, insider trading. Most of the people are not affected by those crimes, to be honest. Okay, majority working class people not even affected by them. But I'm more about severe, like a rob, right? If you go out, you got to rob, you put your life in danger, man. That's not right. So this is my take about
The
it.
fallacy.
I
What was the
think
fallacy that you heard,
white
Sean?
crime is a crime, and also depend on definition. Okay, for example, someone may commit the environmental crime. Okay, for profit to pollute our environment. That's a crime. However, 100 years ago, that's not a crime at all. Every industrialized organization, they dump always everywhere, right? When we started industrial revolution 100 years ago, who worried about the environment? Nobody. Okay, I'm like to focus on crimes, on robbery, violent crimes instead of those. I mean, a lot of say those crimes not important. Yes, it's important, of course, but I think those are more important. Okay, well, America not safe. We have too many crimes. You get robbed. I know two Chinese students in Chicago, University of Chicago. Okay, people just rob them, kill them for a laptop. $200. Okay, that's ridiculous. That's unacceptable. Sorry about that. I got emotional again. Okay.
It's okay. So Sean, I would encourage you to go back to, or use ChatGPT to try to look up what fallacy you think we committed and try to make the argument. This is good practice to sort of be spotting fallacies and try to point out this was the type of fallacy and this is what you said that made me think that you committed a fallacy, because I didn't hear that in your comments. I heard you said that we committed a fallacy, that we both committed multiple fallacies, you said, but that you didn't actually point out which fallacies we committed and where. And so I would encourage you to look at what fallacies you think we committed and try to point it out in a very
Gary,
precise way.
I already had an answer. It's a red herring.
What did you feel like we said?
You changed the conversation about crime. Okay, I'm joking. Okay, I'm joking. All right.
I mean, no, a red herring is like if we were distracting, like
yes,
we were talking about, crime, and we made some comments about how likely crime is and different, that the fact that white collar crime is largely ignored. And I gave a very specific, tangible example of widespread white collar crime that was ignored, most likely because it was white collar crime. And white collar crime is ignored. And then I gave an example of drug offenses, which are generally not ever ignored, like very rarely. Like where I lived in California, people ignored marijuana laws for the most part, because there was a lot of marijuana up there. But most of the time drug offenses are punished with a lot of severity. So
okay,
Sean,
Gary, I gave you one example.
Yeah,
we have limited resources, police or investigators. Okay, there are two cases. One is robbery. Somebody put a gun on someone, robbed it, or almost killed someone. Another one, someone maybe committed fraud, say banking fraud. So which one? You please have a limited resources. So which case police should pursue first? It's simple.
So this Sean, what you just did is actually a false dichotomy fallacy. So it's not like we only can choose to prosecute one or the other, right? We have the resources to prosecute both of those, and keep both types of crime to a reasonable level simultaneously. And we don't have the possibility of preventing either one of those types of crime. Even if we put all police officers on one or the other, it wouldn't prevent all of that type of crime from happening. So, really what we need to do is look at how we balance, how we balance resources so that we minimize the amount of harm caused to society. And both violent crime as well as white collar crime cause harm to society. White collar crime loses economic resources, and economic resources help save lives, right? If there's enough money, someone can get cancer treatment. Right now, lots of people go bankrupt and end up not being able to get cancer treatment, to save their lives because there's not enough money. Well, if we prevented all that white collar crime, maybe there would be enough money. Do you see what I'm saying, Sean?
Yes. Then I got one fallacy, the false dichotomy. Good.
Yeah, that's okay. We all do it. We all do it here and there. I'm sure
Okay.
sometimes too, even though I'm pretty careful. And I'm very open that I might have committed one today. I just would want to know what it is and be able to address it specifically to learn from it. That said, Kathy has her hand up. Why don't you go, Kathy?
Okay, so I had a friend named Andy Novick who was a videographer for the district attorney for the Manhattan district attorney for 30 years. And his job was to videotape crime scenes. And when he wasn't out doing that, his job was to scan the TV on all the channels to see if anybody happened to, make a confession on tape that the district attorney might use in a court case. And what he told me was 90% of New York City violent crime is white people blowing white people away, or white people blowing black people away. But what happens is when crimes get reported, it's up to individual news reporters and companies to go scan the police blotters, and they tend to report on what they think is going to get ratings, and they tend to use their own prejudices. And what gets reported on the news is 90% black crime or black on white crime. It's the absolute opposite, at least in New York City, of what it appears on television. And it's not just one person or a big they doing it. It's human nature for each individual reporter to scan a police blotter and think that they're going to report on some black guy blew away some white fancy person more than they're going to. It's their own individual prejudices of thousands of people that causes it. So also, he videotaped the confession of the Central Park Five. That's just an aside. And he spent years trying to say that those boys were innocent. It's a really big deal. That ended his career. He could no longer carry on. He'd seen so much horrors that when they saw those police beat those confessions out of those boys, he quit and left the city. It's sad.
It is sad. Anyone else have questions, comments, things they want to add? Anyone? Someone must have a question or thought or.
Okay, I'll chip in.
Yeah, go ahead, DLJ.
Next stages, right? So you've so I get sent stuff professionally or privately or whatever. So can you have a look at this kind of thing, right? So you sort of go through things and you say, yeah, that you got an error there, you got an error there, whatever, right? And then you send it back, and you don't expect much, and or maybe a thank you, or get paid. And then occasionally you get somebody or rather indirectly, you find out that people have not taken they've just ignored you said there's a fallacy there and they've ignored it for whatever reason, because they've invested in their idea, or maybe for political reasons, because they don't want, they want to make, they want to make an argument for whatever gain they, what I mean, right? So what do you do then? What's the ethical choice? Because you've been, I've been asked to do something, I've done it, right? But then you find out that somebody's ignored you, or either deliberately or whatever, right? And do you then say, well, what would you do? Would you sort of go, no, hi? Would you go back to them and say, look, you're really wrong there, and you shouldn't be doing that? Or you just kind of walk away? I don't know. What do you want to do? What's the next steps after you? Or they don't even understand the fallacy you pointed out. That was the other thing, right? So how much is your responsibility to say, look, I've got to educate you on the following fallacies? So yeah, how far do you go to change people?
So I generally try to give people the benefit of the doubt that they have good intentions until it becomes beyond a shadow of a doubt clear that they no longer do, and that they're simply mired in confirmation bias. And so I'll try pretty hard to explain to someone why I think they might have made committed a fallacy or made a mistake, but I'll try to ask, do it by asking questions that will help them come to the conclusion that they were wrong themselves. And if by asking questions, they can realize their mistake because of the questions that I asked, and they don't have a good answer to the question, or when they answer the question, they realize that they were wrong by answering it. That's, for me, the trick to getting someone to be more likely to listen to you, is doing it by asking them questions and reiterating back to them their perspective. So you're saying that X, and then, oh, well, if X is true, then would you also say that Y is true? And sort of leading them with a trail of breadcrumbs down the path of realizing their mistake. And I find people are more like, it takes an extra level of thought, but one that I think you're very capable of, because I know you well enough to know that you are. And you kind of have to lead someone with a trail of breadcrumbs down the path to realize their own mistake.
So
yeah.
So I mean, thank you for the compliment. I mean, slightly differently. Do you feel there's an ethical duty? I mean, how far do you go? Like I said, so I've been asked to review a document. I reviewed the document. They paid the consulting to do it, whatever, right? And then there's a misuse or misunderstanding, or they ignore it. Not quite the same as if you're having a conversation with a friend and you want your friend to be more knowledgeable and have better conversations that way, so you get something better from it. But if this is kind of, I asked you to do this, that's it, go away now, right? Do you feel there's some sort of ethical duty to push that and to say, look, I mean, in a way you're saying the meta conversation is, I'm educating you here. take this as free consulting. So is there a duty to do that?
I would argue that well, I guess I'll use the saying here, which is, if we don't help each other, who's going to help us? And I would argue we all do have some ethical duty to help the people that we can influence. And that'll be part of my, we're getting a little sneak preview into my discussion on wisdom, which is that I would argue that we should try to help people that we can influence to the extent that we can influence them. If you think that this is someone that you can't influence and that you're not going to be able to influence them, then it's probably not worth your time to try to do it. But if you think you have the right answer and it's one that's going to help this person be better, then yeah, like put in the time, and try and see if their mind is open. If it becomes very clear that their mind is not open, then at some point it's no longer worth your time to continue. And you should also be open that you may be wrong, right? And maybe your feedback is not right. No, that's never happened, right? No. So I think
so it depends on your personal investment with that person. So if it's your husband or wife or something, then you're going to try a bit harder than if it's
exactly.
yeah, I get that. But Joe, who's I think not here at the moment, but Joe the Stoic would argue there's a broader principle here, that you've got to have courage and all that stuff, right?
I agree with
I think I'm with you. There's a cutoff point. Right? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
There is the age-old adage, don't waste your time on idiots. Just saying. Then there is some wisdom to that as well. I think if somebody's clearly ignorant, just why would you? Why would you bother? It's all an expense.
I think though, like that's true, Will, but I think we should be we should be how do I say this? Like, I think if we ask the right questions, like most people will come around if the right questions are asked to help them realize why they're wrong. But some will be too mired in their confirmation bias to listen at that point. But asking questions is a very non-confrontational way of showing someone why they're wrong. But if you can't
Yeah.
ask good enough questions to help someone realize why they're wrong, then maybe
But I mean,
maybe they're not.
Like it is an investment and an emotional investment. And I think of Don Quixote fighting windmills. Don Quixote, sometimes it's why you even bother. Like,
Right.
does it really, and that's when if it's worth prosecuting the case, do it. Yeah, great. But a lot of the time, 99% of the time, we're not changing anything. Somebody was wrong on the internet,
Yeah. There's a let me I'm gonna come back to it. I'm gonna see if I'm gonna so the analogy that I get is there's a joke where like arguing with certain people is like playing chess with a pigeon. No matter how good you are at chess, the pigeon is just going to knock over all the pieces, crap on the board, and strut around like it's victorious. And so yes, there are those people where you feel like you're just playing chess with a pigeon and they're going to declare victory no matter what is said and done. And those people probably aren't worth debating with. But if you can have a legitimate discussion with someone and you know they really what it comes down to is following the 5 intentions, in my opinion, is are they trying, are you both trying to be the best version of yourself, seek truth and be fair? Are you both transparently sharing your beliefs and listening with an open mind to the other person? Are you both using your critical thinking skills to make better decisions on what's fact and fiction and wisdom from folly? And is the end goal to increase happiness and decrease harm? And if you've got those four, the last is to an eagerness to give and receive love, which I would argue is a higher cause. But those first four are critical to good conversation.
Yeah, and I'm like my default sort of operational position would be, before I launch into it, is this worth debating?
Right.
Is it worth debating? But anyway, that applies to everything in life. Is it worth it?
Yeah.
Mm.
We all have to pick and choose how we spend our time. So,
But of course, there are many things that are very, very much worth debating. And like just a general shift, I think, in thinking is more specific, more important than specific topics, even. Like to just, as you say, like engage in listening to what they're saying, seeing where they're coming from. So if you can permeate that attitude in itself is just as effective as debating individual topics, I guess. But we do defend our positions vehemently.